There was a small wooden house deep in the Vermont pine forest. Inside, a woman had lived her entire life without a single visitor and passed away quietly as if she had never existed. But she left behind a box. Inside were over 50 letters, without stamps, without recipients. They were all written to someone named James, someone who never came back, and never knew that she had never stopped loving him. That woman lived her whole life in silence and departed on a quiet afternoon just the same. No tears, no farewells. But who would have guessed, in that old wooden house there lay a secret that had slept for over half a century, letters that were never sent, and a love forgotten by memory itself. When autumn painted Vermont's countryside in golden hues, the entire town of Woodstock seemed wrapped in time's soft blanket. Crimson maple trees swayed in the breeze, their leaves falling in thin layers by the roadside. In a scene that felt like it had stepped out of an oil painting, there stood a wooden house tucked deep within the pine forest. That house belonged to Eleanor Harper, a woman the whole town knew by name, not because she was famous, but because she had never left. They said she lived like a shadow. No husband, no children, no parties, no social media. Every morning, she sat by a rotting wooden window, holding a cup of tea, her gaze lost in the still lake far away. Year after year, some guessed she had lost a husband. Others said she'd been betrayed. But no one really knew and no one asked, because Eleanor Harper was the kind of person you couldn't easily approach. Not cold, not unpleasant, just something in her eyes that made people feel they weren't close enough to ask. On a pale autumn afternoon, Ms. Harper drew her last breath on her familiar rocking chair. In her hands was an old leather-bound notebook. The final page contained a single trembling line. If one day you find the letters, don't be afraid. Read them with your whole heart. That "you" was Melissa, the young woman who had just graduated in literature from New York, returning to take care of funeral matters for the grandmother she had only met a few times in her life. As a child, Melissa had once spent a summer here, and the only things she remembered were the smell of cinnamon waffles and the off-tuned piano playing in the night. Melissa didn't cry much. Her grandmother was a vague, almost unfamiliar concept to her. But something about that wooden house kept her from leaving right away. It wasn't particularly special, just a few old belongings, some faded black and white photographs, and the musty scent of rotting wood and time. But every time she walked down the creaky wooden hallway, Melissa felt like she was moving through layers of forgotten memory. Something here had been left unsaid. While cleaning the basement, dusty and full of old cardboard boxes, Melissa found a small wooden box, its brass lock rusted. It didn't stand out at all, buried among stacks of papers and Christmas decorations from the 1970s. But what made Melissa stop was a hand-carved inscription on the lid. J.R. To the one who once was my whole world. Melissa sank to the cold cement floor. Her hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside, neatly tied with a worn-out ribbon, were dozens of handwritten letters. Some ink had smudged, and the paper had yellowed with age. There were no stamps, no envelopes, all written on classic office stationery, tidy and clean. And what made Melissa hold her breath was how each letter began. Dear James. James. Who was James? Melissa had never heard her grandmother mention that name. In the family tree, there was no James. No uncle, no friend, no acquaintance. So why was there a whole stack of letters written to such a stranger? Melissa picked up a letter. Her fingers traced the handwriting, soft, rounded, full of emotion. The Eleanor from 1962 didn't resemble the cold grandmother she had known. She was a woman filled with love, longing, and aching memory. Dear James, I saw you in my dream today. Still in that old uniform, still with those eyes. I woke up with tears soaking my pillow. Do you remember me? Or has everything been buried in the memories of war? She read another, dated 1967. Today is your birthday. I made the strawberry cake from 1957, remember? That first time you blew out the candles without making a wish. I wished, if only you would come back. Just once I would tell you everything. And the letters continued on, each one a fragment of Eleanor's heart, carefully laid onto paper, then stored in that wooden box, as if it was the only place she was allowed to love. Not a single line of blame, not a word of bitterness, only waiting. Long and endless, like Vermont's winters. Melissa felt a tightness in her chest. Suddenly, she was angry. Not at her grandmother, but at the man named James. Who was he? How could someone let a woman write him so many letters over decades without a single reply? No letter, no trace, just absence, and a woman growing old in her waiting. But then, did he even know? Had she ever sent the letters? Melissa looked closely. No postmarks, no envelopes. These letters had never been sent. So, why did she write? Why keep them? Why never tell anyone? Had Eleanor Harper lived her entire life remembering a man no one in the family ever knew? And why did she leave a final message saying, if one day you find the letters, read them with your whole heart? Melissa didn't find the answer right away. But one question echoed in her mind. Who is James R. Whitmore? And something else chilled her to the bone. Why had her grandmother written all those letters, but never meant to send them? What had happened between them? As night fell over Woodstock, Melissa lit a small candle by the window, where her grandmother used to sit. She held the box of letters to her chest, heart pounding. She knew she couldn't ignore this, because within those letters was a part of Eleanor's life that had never been told, a truth hidden by silence and time. And maybe, if she could find James, if he was still alive, she would be the one to bring that story back into the light. What do you think? If you were Melissa, would you keep searching? Would you dare to open that door to the past, where love was left behind, memories forgotten, and a heart shattered day by day? The early winter wind blew through the gaps in the wooden doors, making the worn-out curtains sway gently like the last breath of the past still lingering. Melissa sat silently by the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the faded handwriting of her late grandmother. In front of her was a thick stack of letters, tied with a fraying moss-green ribbon, the mark of time and of things that were never spoken aloud. She had lost count of how many she'd read. Each letter opened a door to a part of Eleanor's memory kept hidden for a lifetime. Some lines made Melissa pause for a long time, swallowing her tears so they wouldn't blur the already faded words. Strangely, the more she read, the closer she felt to the grandmother she once thought was a stranger. Dear James, today I sat in the rocking chair, listening again to that old song we danced to at the fair that year. I can't remember the title, only that you laughed when I stepped on your foot. I wish I could do that just one more time. Melissa wondered. What did they have? A brief love? An unkept promise? Or a secret beyond the understanding of a granddaughter like her? She began sorting the letters by date. The first one was written in 1956, when Eleanor was just over 20. And the last one was from 2008, just a few years before her eyesight failed, and she could no longer write. Over 50 years, more than 50 letters, almost one each year, sometimes 2 or 3. There were years with gaps, as if she had tried to let go, but just couldn't. I haven't written to you in 4 years. I thought I had forgotten. But then I saw a man in a coat just like yours at the supermarket. I followed him through 3 aisles, only to find out it wasn't you. Melissa felt like someone was squeezing her chest. The words were too real, too human. Eleanor didn't write like she was telling a story. She was living in every word, writing not for anyone to read, but to soothe an ache that had no name. But something still didn't sit right. Something was off. Why hadn't a single letter been sent? No envelope, no postmark, no carbon copy. She had kept them all carefully, like treasure, but never meant to share them. Melissa began searching the house. In her grandmother's study, behind stacks of old hardcovers, she discovered a locked drawer. Luckily, a small key tied to an old photo frame of her great-grandfather still worked. Inside the drawer was a black leather notebook with only one line on the cover: whispered letters. It wasn't a diary. It was a record, a log where Eleanor noted what she wrote, when and why. She never sent them. 1958, third letter, written after seeing James's mother at the bakery. She didn't recognize me. Wondered if James still remembers my name. 1963, wrote this after watching news of the Vietnam War on TV. Wondered if James was deployed. Is that why he never came back? 1970, 14th birthday letter for him. Not sent. Reason: if he has a wife and kids, I'd ruin everything. Melissa felt her heart ache with every beat. Her grandmother had lived nearly her entire life in imagination and inner turmoil, caught between a love that never died and respect for a life that might have moved on. And then she found another letter, the only one addressed to herself. To Melissa, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry I didn't leave you much. Just this old house and the letters. You might find them strange, but to me, they were lifelong companions. I never sent them because I wasn't sure. If James was still alive? If he was happy? I used to think I would forget. But memory doesn't obey the will. It sleeps, but it never dies. If you're curious, go to this place. Hope Springs Veterans Home, Syracuse, New York. That's the last place I knew he lived, after the war. Don't expect anything. But if he's still alive, tell him. I never stopped writing. That last line choked Melissa up. Her hands trembled, her eyes blurred with tears. She had read dozens of letters, and now, this one felt like the missing piece that made the whole picture clear. James didn't leave Eleanor. He vanished from her life, and she lived in waiting, never daring to ask again. But why didn't she go to him? Why didn't she travel to Syracuse? Melissa looked around the house. The old photographs, the dusty piano, and the clock frozen at 9:17 a.m. Was that the moment she passed? Or was it a message? She knew these questions couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, the sky was thick with fog. Melissa carefully packed the letters back into the box, wrapped it in her grandmother's wool scarf. She placed the box on the back seat of the old pickup truck, a relic from her great-grandfather. In her hand was the address written in the final letter: Hope Springs Veterans Home, Syracuse, a place more than 400 miles from Vermont. She didn't know if James was still alive, if he was still lucid enough to remember Eleanor, or even if he had ever truly been there. But something inside her urged her to go, not out of curiosity, but because she felt as though she was carrying a piece of her grandmother's heart to where it truly belonged. And who knows, maybe in those letters that were never sent, there was something that had never been heard before. The road from Woodstock to Syracuse stretched in the pale gray tones of a gloomy winter morning. A drizzle tapped steadily on the windshield, like a rhythm echoing in Melissa's mind. On the passenger seat, the moss-green ribboned wooden box lay still, like a quiet companion, carrying the long past of a love that was never fully spoken. Melissa didn't know what awaited her at the end of this journey. All she knew was that with every mile, she drew closer to the man her grandmother had loved all her life, in silence, in solitude, and with the fragile hope that her love had not been one-sided. But what if James Whitmore had passed away? What if he never knew that Eleanor still remembered him? What if he had never loved her back? These questions surged again and again like waves crashing onto her shore of thoughts. And the biggest, most painful question of all remained. If either of them had just sent one letter, would everything have been different? Hope Springs. Veterans' Home stood on the outskirts of Syracuse, nestled in a quiet neighborhood lined with ancient oak trees draped in moss. The entrance gate was made of white-painted steel, with a small plaque in dignified lettering, a resting place for heroes forgotten by time. Melissa entered the reception hall with a feeling she couldn't name, a mix of nervousness, anticipation, and unfamiliarity. She clutched the slip of paper bearing the name she was looking for, James R. Whitmore, as if it were the last thread holding a long, unfinished story. The middle-aged nurse at the front desk looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "Mr. Whitmore is still here. Room 14A, West Wing. But he doesn't talk much, hardly interacts with anyone. Are you sure you want to meet him?" Melissa swallowed dryly. She wasn't sure of anything, but she nodded. The West Wing was eerily quiet. Each room had a window facing a small garden where weathered benches rustled gently beneath layers of fallen leaves. Room 14A was slightly ajar. Melissa knocked softly. There was no reply. She pushed the door open. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered. Inside was a simple room. Hospital bed, small table, a few old photo frames. And there, sitting by the window, an elderly man stared out as if the entire world was beyond that pane of glass. His hair was white, his beard sparse, his weathered face etched with deep lines carved by time. But what made Melissa freeze wasn't his age, it was his eyes. Green, deep, and hauntingly familiar. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked gently. The man didn't turn immediately. After a pause, he replied hoarsely, "Who calls me that anymore?" Melissa stepped closer and pulled from her pocket an old photo of Eleanor in her youth, her smile tilted gently over a teacup and a brick wall behind her. James looked at the photo. His eyes froze as if something within him had cracked open. "Eleanor," he whispered. Just one word. But Melissa's entire world tilted. He remembered. They sat in silence for quite a while. Melissa didn't know where to begin. She didn't dare ask, didn't dare speak, until James finally did, eyes still fixed on the photograph. Is she still alive?" Melissa shook her head. "My grandma passed away last month. But before she died, she left me something that was never spoken." She opened the wooden box. The letters were taken out, one by one, as light as falling leaves. James reached out with trembling hands to touch each page. His eyes brimmed with tears. "I wrote to her my whole life, but I never sent them. I was afraid. I didn't know if she'd still want to see me. After the war, I lost my memory for almost a year. When I came back, I couldn't remember her name, her face, anything. And when the memories finally returned, she was already gone." Melissa was stunned. The pieces were starting to fit. Her grandmother had written letters, thinking he'd forgotten, and he had written letters thinking he no longer had a chance. "Why didn't you try to find her?" Melissa asked, her voice catching. James sat silent for a long time. Then he let out a long breath, as if it was his first breath in 60 years. "I did. I went to Brooklyn, even Vermont. but no one knew where she was. I wrote letters as a way to stay alive, not to send, but to remember I was once loved. Melissa placed Eleanor's letters on his lap. James held them as though cradling something sacred. Each line, each stroke of ink, a blade both sharp and tender. She saw him cry, not the sobs of sorrow, but the tears of someone who had finally been forgiven. "If only I had sent just one letter. Just one," he repeated, like a mantra. Melissa took his hand. "My grandma never blamed you. She just wanted you to know." She never stopped writing. That afternoon, James sat by the window, holding the box of letters. He asked Melissa to play the old song, the one Eleanor had mentioned in a 1956 letter. The melody filled the room, a vintage jazz tune, low, quiet, full of longing. He closed his eyes, softly. "I see her, dancing with me at that fair. She's stepping on my foot again, and laughing. For the first time in decades, I hear that laugh, inside my own heart." Night fell. Melissa left the home, carrying the now empty box. James kept the letters. Just before she stepped out the door, he called after her, "Melissa, thank you for bringing Eleanor back to me, even if it's only in memory." She turned, smiling through her tears. The air in Syracuse was colder than usual the next morning, as mist still clung thick to the oak branches outside the window of the nursing home. Melissa returned to room 14A with a box of waffles, the kind her grandmother used to make, hoping they might stir something in James, a memory long buried. But when she opened the door, he was no longer sitting by the window as he had the evening before. He was lying in bed, eyes closed, breathing steady but faint. On his chest lay a new letter, fresh paper, the ink still fragrant, and the recipient's name written clearly. "Eleanor Harper, to the one I still love." Melissa sat down quietly, feeling as though time itself had paused to make space for this moment. He had written one last letter, not for anyone else, not for the future, but for the woman who had lived on inside him, never once fading. "Dear Eleanor, if you're reading this letter, then you've surely found the words I once wrote, the ones I never sent, the things I never said. I don't know why we lost each other, only that I never forgot you. I remember every strand of your hair, every word you said, every silent glance on those autumn afternoons. Do you still remember Central Park? You once said that if there's a next life, we should meet there again. A place with no war, no interruptions, no regrets. I'm going to sleep for a while, and if the next life is real, let me find you, Eleanor, wherever you are, no matter how long it takes. James." Melissa folded the letter, tears falling onto the edge of the page. A part of her wanted to wake him up, to tell him her grandmother had read everything, had forgiven everything. But he already knew. In the way he wrote, in the way he looked at her for the last time, he knew Eleanor had never left his heart, even if she had left this world. She stayed with him the whole morning, telling him stories about the letters Eleanor had written, about how she lit a candle each year on his birthday, about the strawberry cake she still baked, even if she was the only one eating it. She spoke of that first winter Eleanor didn't go outside because her legs were too weak, but still sat by the window for hours, watching the snow fall, as if hoping to see James return through the white haze. James could no longer hear clearly, but his eyes fluttered gently, as if in response. There was something, like a faint echo from the far side of memory. And then he smiled. A final smile Melissa knew wasn't for her. It was for Eleanor. The one he still saw in Central Park, in a seafoam green dress, low heels, and hair soft and loose in the breeze of a June afternoon. James Whitmore passed away that very afternoon. No one came to the funeral. No family. No old friends. Only Melissa, standing alone beneath an old oak tree, holding a bouquet of lavender Eleanor once planted in the backyard. She read his final letter again, this time to imprint it in her own memory, as part of a story she had witnessed from beginning to end, but could never change. Two people who loved each other their entire lives, but were never sure the other still loved them. Two worlds that once shared a beginning, but were divided by silence, memory, and fear. Melissa didn't blame them. How could she? When she knew all too well, some things in life go unspoken, not because there isn't enough love, but because there's too much. So much that the fear of losing it outweighs the courage to say it aloud. She understood James had lived with guilt, and Eleanor had lived with unanswered hope. They both chose to protect that love like a fragile treasure, rather than risk it in a reality full of chances. But what they didn't know is that while they held on to silence, time did not wait. Back in Woodstock, Melissa did the one last thing she felt she could do for both of them. She picked a gently sunny day, took James's ashes, and returned to the hill behind Eleanor's house, where wild daisies she once planted now danced in the wind. She dug a small hole beside the old apple tree, placed the urn in it, and scattered dried lavender on top. "You're with her now," she whispered. There were no church bells, no choir, only the rustling wind through the trees, and her heartbeat, slower now, more peaceful. Because she knew what Eleanor had hoped for most had finally come true. Not in this life, but in some quiet, complete form, they had been reunited. Melissa decided to keep the wooden house. No selling, no tearing down. She stayed there through that winter, arranging the letters in glass frames, hanging them on the walls like a tiny museum to a love vast and unspoken. And then, as if by fate, an independent publisher learned of the story. They proposed turning the letters into a book, unedited, unembellished, just as they were. Raw declarations of love lost too long in silence. The book was titled, "To the One Who Never Got the Letter." It became a phenomenon, not because it was dramatic or poetic, but because it was real. So real that everyone who read it saw themselves in it. In every unsent love letter, every birthday remembered in silence, every message written, then erased, every longing hidden because of pride, fear, or the belief that they've probably forgotten me by now. I once wrote to someone I loved, but never sent the letter. Every year on his birthday, I check his profile. I just never say anything. Eleanor's story is mine too. I've got a nameless box of letters no one knows about. Melissa began to realize the story of Eleanor and James wasn't rare. It was symbolic, a symbol of all the love that got away, a symbol of all the parallel lives that never intersected, and above all, a quiet, aching reminder that love unspoken does not mean love unreal. If someone visits Woodstock on an autumn day now, they might see a small wooden house nestled by the pines. Inside, there's a little desk, a window that opens toward the lake, and a young woman writing. She doesn't write to anyone in particular, but every word she types carries the breath of Eleanor, of James, and of a love that lasted a lifetime, just to be acknowledged. What about you? If you loved someone but weren't sure they still loved you, would you dare to write it down? October in Woodstock is colder than most places, especially when the sun dips behind the ancient maples, casting a golden-orange glow across the mirror-like lake. In the old wooden house where Eleanor Harper once lived her whole life, now only Melissa remains, the granddaughter who carries the hearts of two people who loved each other all their lives, but never fully said so. She sits by the window, a cup of tea in hand, staring toward the apple tree in the garden, where James's ashes rest beside the lavender Eleanor once planted. She never knew he was still alive, and he never got to hear her say she never stopped loving him. They lived like that. They loved like that. And in the end, they left like that too, carrying with them all the words left unsaid. The book, To the One Who Never Got the Letter, was published a month later. Melissa hadn't expected much. She just wanted to preserve an emotional legacy, a testament that some love doesn't need to be loud or present, but still lives strong and quiet in someone's heart, forever. Unexpectedly, the book struck a chord. Thousands wrote in, letters, emails, comments, sharing their own stories. Unsent letters, unspoken confessions. Messages typed, then deleted. Longings buried out of fear, pride, or the belief that they've probably forgotten me. I once wrote to my ex, but never dared to send it. Every birthday I still think of him. I just never say it. Eleanor's story is mine. I too keep a box of letters without a name. Melissa realized Eleanor and James's story wasn't an exception. It was a mirror for every missed love, a mirror for every parallel life never allowed to cross. And more than anything, a soft, piercing truth. Love not spoken doesn't mean it never lived. But if you never speak, you may never know that the other person is also holding a box of letters never sent. One afternoon, an elderly couple knocked on Melissa's door. They were old friends of James, fellow soldiers from the war who had long thought he was dead. They brought with them an old photo album, inside of which was a picture of young James, smiling brightly, standing beside a dark-haired woman at a summer festival in Brooklyn, 1956. That woman was Eleanor. They were the most beautiful couple around. Everyone thought they'd get married. But then the war came, and James never returned, the old woman said, her eyes brimming with tears. If we had known he was still alive, if we had known she was still waiting. Melissa gave a sad smile. No one knew, but they loved each other, all their lives. She opened an old drawer, took out 2 letters, the final one from Eleanor and the final one from James. Placing them side by side, she whispered, as if speaking to them both. If only you had written to each other once and sent it. Just once, and everything might have been different. But life doesn't work on if only. It leaves blanks. It tests us with silence. And sometimes, the people who love each other the most are the ones who never meet again. Melissa began organizing small gatherings in town, a place where people were invited to come and read aloud a letter they had once kept. Some wrote to deceased parents, some wrote to old lovers, some wrote to their 18-year-old selves. That little wooden house, once cloaked in silence, now became a space where unspoken things could finally be voiced, in real voices, with real tears and real heartbeats. One winter night, as snow fell gently across the white porch roof, Melissa stood in the doorway, gazing at the star-filled sky. She took out a blank piece of paper and wrote one line, "To the man I never met, but thank you for loving Eleanor to the very end." She folded it, placed it in a glass jar, and buried it beside the apple tree, where now Eleanor and James lay together at last. As the sun faded in Woodstock, the lake mirrored the last streaks of light for the day, dim and distant, like a memory no one had yet named. Melissa stood on the porch, her hand resting on the wooden window frame, where her grandmother once sat each morning, looking out over the lake. That place where Eleanor once wrote each day, not for the public, not for posterity, but for one person, the one who never read any of it. Now everything was complete. The letters had been read. James and Eleanor, now together again, beneath the apple tree in the garden, surrounded by dried lavender and the hush of wind whispering through the leaves. The book had been published. The story had been told. The townspeople had found a piece of their own past in the quiet love between these two souls. But in Melissa's heart, this was when a new question began, one without an answer. How many loves out there have been lost simply because no one dared to send a message? How many hearts are still waiting, not because they stopped loving, but because they're unsure if the other remembers? If Eleanor had just sent one letter, if James had found the courage to knock on her door one more time, if only one of them had spoken first, if one of them had asked, "Do you still remember me? Did you ever forget?" Maybe everything would have been different. Maybe there would have been no years of silent writing, no wooden box buried in a basement, no recurring dreams of a summer fair in 1956. But life doesn't run on maybe. It runs on action. Either you act or you live with regret. Melissa remembered the last night beside James's hospital bed. He held her hand, fragile as the last leaf clinging to a branch, and said something that stayed with her. "I used to think time would help me forget her. But the more the years passed, the more I remembered every small detail. Love doesn't vanish. It simply turns to silence, flows quietly like water beneath thick ice. Some touch it, some never do. And now, with the story complete, with the final letters sealed behind glass, with the ashes returned to the earth, Melissa understood that her role wasn't just as a storyteller. She was the one left to ask the final question. On behalf of Eleanor, on behalf of James, and on behalf of millions who have loved, but never dared to speak. Are you writing a letter you're too afraid to send? She turned toward the camera. The golden light of sunset cast a soft glow across her face, gentle, real, and close. 1 week after the video "To the One Who Never Got the Letter" was posted, Melissa woke up on a foggy Sunday morning, opened her laptop, and was stunned. Thousands of messages had flooded in. Not the usual "great video" or "so touching" type of comments. They were letters, real letters. A letter from a 35-year-old woman who had kept a box of unsent messages to an ex-boyfriend for 12 years. A letter from a 62-year-old man who had never told his late wife that he secretly read her journals and cried every night after she passed. A letter from a 17-year-old boy, written to his best friend in class, who never knew he had loved her since the 6th grade. Melissa read each one. Every word, every sentence carved itself deep into her mind. Eleanor and James's story did not end at their graves. It was just beginning, in the hearts of those still living. She decided to read some of those letters aloud in new videos. Not to pity, not to expose, but simply to say, "You're not alone, and your feelings are not invisible. I love you, but I was never brave enough to say it. I was afraid you'd leave. I used to wait for your message every night. I thought I was pathetic for missing someone who had already forgotten me. On your birthday every year, I set an alarm for 12:01 a.m. I never send anything. I just need to know I'm the first person who remembered you." When you hear these words, what do you feel? Weakness or strength? The kind of strength that lives in human emotion when there's nothing left to hold on to except words never sent. Melissa didn't stop there. She launched Send It Day, a movement where people were invited to write down something they had kept inside and then choose. Send it. Burn it. But admit it was once real. Keep it. But stop pretending it doesn't exist. The result? Nearly 15,000 people joined within the first 3 days. And then, things happened no one could have predicted. A young man sent an old letter to his ex-girlfriend, the one who had ended their relationship, with just 3 words. "Let's stop here." She read the letter, cried, called him, and they started again, not from the beginning, but from where their story had been left unfinished. An anonymous father wrote a letter apologizing to his daughter for not calling her in 8 years. The letter was read by the daughter on YouTube. She didn't reply right away, but in the comment section, she left just one line: "Dad, I'm still here." And in that moment, Melissa realized every forgotten love story doesn't really end. It just pauses, waiting for someone brave enough to write the next line. And what about you? Don't scroll down to the comments just yet. Pause, take a deep breath, and ask yourself the simplest question: who am I thinking of right now? You don't have to name them. You don't need to write a long paragraph. Just a word, just a sentence. Because if you feel your heart beat faster reading this, then chances are you too are carrying a letter you've never sent. Maybe it's to someone you once loved, maybe someone who left, maybe someone who's still right beside you every day. But you've never had the courage to say, "You know, sometimes I'm more afraid of losing you than losing myself." Melissa looked into the camera, her gaze deep and calm. "I'm not a therapist. I'm not here to heal anyone. I'm just someone who once witnessed two people who loved each other, but lost one another because of silence. And I'm here to ask you one thing. Do you want your story to end the same way? If your answer is no, then right now, take action. Write one line to the person you once thought of. And if you can't send it, leave a comment here. Anonymously is fine, but say something. And if you're too shy, just leave an emoji, a symbol, a sign that you, just like Eleanor, once loved someone and never truly forgot. This community is reading these words, not to judge you, but to recognize themselves in you. Because every heart that's ever broken shares one thing in common. It still beats quietly, powerfully, and waiting to be heard. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with the person you once thought about, or send it to someone you hope will feel what you feel today. And if you want to keep walking with us through stories that are raw, heartfelt, and touch the deepest corners of the soul, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so each week we can continue writing these letters never sent to this life we're living. Because sometimes, one story is enough to change how you see love, silence, and memory. Thank you for listening. Now it's your turn to tell your story. What will you write today? Leave a comment below.